Hey, how's it going, everybody? Today I'm going to be continuing my series where I review album covers from my CD collection. If you haven't seen the first video yet, check that out right up there. Before we get started, please consider subscribing to support the channel. Alright, so first up in this stack is going to be Bonham, The Disregard of Timekeeping. Let me move this so that it's not reflecting light off of it. I've always loved this album cover. I have a lot of memories with it going back to when I was about 6 years old. And there's so many things to look at on this. I love the guy that's sitting in the chair and it's kind of breaking from underneath him. And also I think it's a really cool touch to put the legs up in the air so that it kind of makes you want to open it up and see what's on the other side of that image. And right here is the full image where you've got the guy just kind of hanging up in the air and he's shooting pool there. That's really cool. And as far as the typography goes, I'm a huge sucker for like original typography, and it's obvious that this was specifically created for this band, or at least this album cover, because I've never seen this font anywhere else before. So overall, really cool album cover, really awesome design work, and I love this album cover. And the album itself is excellent, no skippable songs on there. All right, next up is going to be Broken Bracelet by Michelle Branch, and this is one that I actually had signed by her when I saw her in concert in Nashville. And this was put out independent of any record label, and it's very unusual to see a design of this high caliber. I'm not saying that this is the greatest design of all time, but what I am saying is that it's a very well put together and thought out design. And with the lowercase typewriter font, it's definitely kind of carrying over that 90s grunge type of design to it, even though she's not grunge or even alternative rock, but I still think that it works very well, especially for an independent release. And the collage of the broken bracelet just kind of laying on top of the picture of her, I've always thought it was really cool. All right, next up is The Spirit Room by Michelle Branch. And this one right here is also really cool. It's got kind of like that typewriter type of font that's kind of carried over from the last album. And you can tell this is definitely more of a staged photo. It was definitely taken with the intent for an album cover around this time period. This was actually pretty standard. You know, you would definitely see the artist on the cover itself. This was her breakthrough album that kind of really catapulted her into the mainstream. And everything is very well put together. It may not be the most original design you've ever seen, but it actually does work really well. And I think that that is kind of the key to design, is that you want whatever you're putting together to work well for what it is you're doing. All right, so next up is Hotel Paper from Michelle Branch. This is my personal favorite album cover of Michelle Branch. I'm a big sucker for like reds, oranges, and yellows, everything at the beginning of the rainbow. And I really do like the nice clean type that they went with. They kind of got away from the 90s grunge. And around the time that the early 2000s were happening, this came out, I believe, in 2003. You started to kind of see that move away from the 90s and the Y2K typography, and just kind of going into a little bit more of a clean type of design. And I really I love it. And really, I just love everything that's about all of this, including all of the album artwork. There's a lot of pictures of her in here, and it's really well put together, very well designed, and I think it's great. All right, so next up is the album 40 Acres by Caedmon's Call. This is a Christian band, and I have always loved this cover because I really like high concept type of things, where the album cover itself does a really good job of kind of communicating to you the message and the overall feel of the album. Like when I look at this album cover and I listen to the music, they match up perfectly. I'm not really a huge fan of the type that they use for either one of these. Like I see how the roughness of it kind of does work with the 40 Acres image and everything, and they do a good job of balancing these two with each other because one is kind of rough and one is very clean. But still, I think they could have done a little bit better with the typography of this. And really, this is unheard of in the Christian music community, but they could have easily left off the type, and I think this would have been a lot stronger. All right, next up is Be Not Nobody from Vanessa Carlton. I've always loved the original artwork that is on this. It's so cool to have Vanessa's face right there with that abstract type of artwork behind her. Usually this is the kind of font that you would hear a lot of designers bash on and everything. I actually don't hate it. I actually really like it a lot. I think that the type really works its way into the design very well. And this is one of those album covers where the type was obviously crafted specifically for this design. It's not like they had a picture of Vanessa and then just slapped the font on there and then just said, okay, well, which one works best with this design? You can tell that it was worked into the design and it was very intentional. And this is definitely one of those albums that, you know, if you went to the record store in the early 2000s, you were definitely going to come across this and it would have stood out to you. All All right, next up is Harmonium by Vanessa Carlton. This one is my personal favorite album of hers. The cover itself is really cool. I get what they were doing. Like, they wanted her to have her kind of sitting in front of her piano and just kind of leaning up behind it and everything. I think that everything here works very well together. I'm not a huge fan of the typography, though. It's a little bit too rock and roll for the sound that she was putting out at the time. And I think that you could have done something a little bit cleaner. It doesn't have to be like Helvetica or like a super straight sans serif or anything. But I think that there could have been a little bit more experimentation with typography there, and it could have balanced it out just a little bit more. Don't hate it, but I also don't love it either. All right, next up is Heroes and Thieves by Vanessa Carlton. You can tell I'm a big Vanessa Carlton fan. And normally I would see a photo of somebody like this and I wouldn't really be the biggest fan of it. I'm not like too big of a fan of like just the glum type of thing, you know, whatever. But the album cover as a whole actually works really well. The surrounding artwork, the typography, all of the little ornamental stuff in the corners, it really does lend well to that. You wouldn't want to see all of that and then see her, you know, a big, you know, like a picture of her just smiling it up really big. And it is a little bit more of a down type of album in terms of its mood, so I totally understand what they were going for here. Next up is Love is an Art by Vanessa Carlton. Now, this is an album that I really, really love a lot, and this is one that if you didn't know it was Vanessa Carlton, you wouldn't know it was Vanessa Carlton. The music on this is so different and so unique, completely different from anything else that she did before, and it has a completely different vibe. And I love the simplicity of this album cover. The hand with the tiger, it's really cool, very interesting type of imagery there. The balance of the colors is just perfect. I love the red and the yellow. And I also love the designer's guts to use a serif type, especially during a time where sans serif type was all the rage. You know, this album is only 4 years old, but you know, you go back 4 years ago and there was like, you do not use serif type. So major props to the designer on that for sticking with a serif type. I'm a big fan of this album cover. All right, so next up is Addicted to Jesus by Carmen. This is an album that I've had this CD since I was probably 8 years old. And this really is one of those cases where you look at the album cover, you listen to the music, and it perfectly captures the feel of the music that's on this album. If you're not familiar, Carmen was a Christian singer that did every single genre that you could possibly imagine. He was a jack of all trades, but a master of none. In terms of actual musical quality, it may not have always been there, but I actually think that this does a really good job. I do love the distress type that's going on here. That was something that was like a little bit early for its time. The whole grunge movement was like just barely starting to happen. So that kind of distress type that was there, you didn't really see a whole lot of that at this time period. Of course, within the next year or two you would, but not really in 91, and certainly not around the time that this album was being recorded. All right, next up is a forgotten band from the 90s, Chalk Farm, and the album is Notwithstanding. And this is a really cool album cover. I love like the little tree with the roots and the one flower that's right there. It's a really cool conceptual album, and I have always loved the typography. For some strange reason, I have always been a sucker for a mixture of lowercase and capital letters. And I've always loved the lowercase c and the capital N in Chalk Farm. Why did they do it? I have no clue. They probably don't know why. It probably just looked cool. And even though I probably would have chosen a different font for the title, I do love the fact that they balance the two, and those two fonts work really well against each other. Even in its simplicity, this is definitely something that would catch your eye, especially if it was facing you at the record store. All right, next up is Guppy by Charlie Bliss. So Charlie Bliss is probably the best band that I've ever seen that was an opening band. I saw them open for Veruca Salt back in 2015 or 16 in Nashville, and they blew me away. I've been following them ever since then, and their music is great. It's very 90s, especially their first album. This is such a 90s album if there ever was one that was released in 2017, and it sounded like it was recorded in the 90s and then held on for 20 years and then released later. But anyway, we need to take a look at the cover of this. So I love the cover of this album. I love the close-up of holding this fish along with all the colors that are in here. Lots of whites, yellows, oranges, and a little bit of green right there in the bottom right corner. And the typography on this, absolutely perfect, totally nailed it. The type and the album artwork really work well together, and somehow this album cover just perfectly captures the sound that is on this album. And this is another one of those albums where every single song is a perfect 10, Great album, no skips. All right, next up is the album Young Enough by Charly Bliss. And you can definitely tell from this that they had some success with that first album, and then they had a little bit more of a production budget, because this very cool staged photo was obviously very well thought out, and I love everything that goes with it, and I love the typography that balances with it, that very thick serif type. It's perfectly placed in that corner. This was all very well thought out and very well planned. The album cover has a certain air of mystery to it, and what's really cool about this one is that their first album was a very 90s driven sound. This one is a very 80s driven sound, and that's what I've always loved about this band, is that each album is going to sound progressively different. I know that there are a lot of Charly Bliss fans that are saying that maybe their third album will focus more on 70s types of sound, and if they're going to go that direction where every album has a different type of sound to it, I am all for it, because everything they've done so far is fantastic. All right, so next up is Super Moon by Charly Bliss, and I actually have the promo version of this because it's the only one that's available that's on CD, and it doesn't have the artwork that goes along with it. It's obviously a companion piece to the album cover of Young Enough. I love everything about this. It's really cool. Eva looks great in her outfit, and I love Sam's reflection in the mirror. It's just a really cool album cover. Even though it's not an album, it's an EP. And it's also really cool that they decided to forego all of the typography. It's just this photo. All right, so next up is All About Jesus by Charmaine. This is another Christian singer, and this has always been one of my personal favorite praise and worship albums. It's extraordinarily rare for a Christian artist to put out a praise and worship album as their debut album, but that's what she did, and this album is awesome if you're a praise and worship fan. And I've always loved the close-up image of the rain pouring down on her, along with the Bauhaus typography. I think this is really cool considering its early 2000s release, and yes, this album cover definitely would have kind of gotten lost with the other Christian albums that were out at the time, but it is a really cool design and it perfectly captures the music. All right, next up is The Ghosts That Haunt Me by Crash Test Dummies. This is a really, really cool album cover. I'm not at all familiar with the original artwork, but I'm assuming this is some kind of a painting that was not commissioned for the album but utilized for it, and the use of it is just really cool. I love this album cover so much. If I had to nitpick something, I would probably say that the type doesn't need that stroke on it. With the dark blue over the artwork, that yellow could easily contrast against that. And also, one more thing, if you knew nothing at all about the Crash Test Dummies and you saw this in the record store, you might think that they were some kind of a rock or alternative band, and they are definitely not that. They are more of a folk band and really, really good music, but the cover might be just a tad misleading. All right, next one up is the big one from Crash Test Dummies, God Shuffled His Feet. This is a fantastic album cover. It's one that takes an original painting and then superimposes the band members' heads on each one of the characters. It's funny, it's original, and it doesn't do too much with the type. It's got kind of a similar logo with the Crash Test Dummies up there, but at the bottom it's just that really simple and italic God Shuffled His Feet. Fantastic album. If you're not familiar with the Crash Test Dummies, at least give them a listen. And the last one up from them is Jingle All the Way by Crash Test Dummies. This is another funny album cover because you got the distorted Santa and Mrs. Claus and everything just kind of waving at you. The type is definitely something that you would normally see on a Christmas album, so I think that they really nailed that. And then the title for the album is very 1950s retro. By the time this album was released, you were probably familiar enough with the Crash Test Dummies to know what they were going to do with Christmas music, and it's great. All right, this is the last band that will be in this video, and this is going to be the Cranberries, and this is their debut album. Everybody else is doing it, so why don't we? And if you look at this cover, you can tell already you are going to definitely feel some vibes when you're listening to this album. From start to finish, this album is a masterpiece. It's wonderful, and the cover of it is perfect. The typography on it is perfect. There's not a lot that I'm going to nitpick here on this album cover. It's just great. All right, next up is No Need to Argue by Crash Test Dummies, and I'm pretty much going to echo what I said about the first album because this album is also really great. I love how these two perfectly contrast each other. You know, you've got the dark on one side. Let me move this over here. You got the dark on one side and the light on the other, and they perfectly complement each other because they're utilizing the couch. So very interesting idea that carried over the first two albums, and they were able to balance and contrast them in a very effective way. Alright, so last album in this video is To the Faithful Departed by the Cranberries. This one right here, I'm not as big a fan of this album as I was the first two, but I still like it. Salvation and Free to Decide are both wonderful songs. And as far as the cover goes, I've always liked this cover. I've always thought it was really cool with that yellow corner. It definitely has those same vibes that the first two album covers had, but it's not doing the same thing again. You know, they did it twice. Those two albums really complement each other very well. And this one is kind of going off in a different direction. And I really like the matching instruments against the yellow wall, and just the fact that you see all the band members with their instruments, that's really cool. It might have been really cool if they carried over the logo from the first two albums, but I understand the change in the typography because those two matched each other, and this one doesn't match those two. And overall, it's a good album. It's just not as good as the first two. All right, well, I'm glad that I reached the end of that because my voice is just shot. I've got to go lay down and get some rest. Be sure to stay tuned for part 3, where I go through the next 20 or so CDs in my collection and talk about those album covers. If you haven't already, please be sure to subscribe to support the channel, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.